Jake Whitmore's hand froze on his radio, the crackling weather report dying mid-sentence as his headlamp cut through the Montana blizzard. 20 feet ahead, what he'd mistaken for a fallen log wasn't wood at all. It was a massive German shepherd, motionless in the snow, and something small was pressed against its belly. It wasn't just any child. It was a little girl, maybe 6 years old, her lips blue with hypothermia, but her chest still rising and falling in shallow breaths. His partner's voice exploded through the radio behind him, the static-filled words barely audible over his own thundering heartbeat. Equipment scattered as Jake stumbled forward, his military training warring with the impossibility of what lay before him. The dog's eyes opened, just barely, and fixed on Jake with an intelligence that made his blood run cold, as if those dying brown eyes held secrets that could destroy him. "Base, I need an emergency medical team at Grid 7 Alpha," Jake commanded into his radio, his voice steady despite the chaos in his chest. How long had they been out here? And why was this child still alive? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. 3 days before Jake's discovery, Grace Sullivan sat at her kitchen table in the pre-dawn darkness of Millbrook, Montana, staring at the foreclosure notice that had arrived with Tuesday's mail. At 72, she had survived 40 years as head nurse at Millbrook General Hospital, buried her husband Harold after 51 years of marriage, and endured the devastating loss of her only son Michael in Iraq 5 years ago. But this piece of paper, this cold, bureaucratic threat to take away the home where she had raised her boy and loved her husband, felt like the final blow. The house creaked around her in the familiar way that old homes do, each sound a memory. Harold's workshop in the basement still smelled of sawdust and motor oil. Michael's bedroom remained exactly as he'd left it before his final deployment, his high school baseball trophies catching the morning light that filtered through windows she could no longer afford to heat properly. Her nurse's pension, once adequate, had been cut when the hospital closed its cardiac wing. The property taxes had doubled. The mathematics were simple and brutal. She had 30 days to find $12,000 or lose everything. Grace pulled Harold's old army jacket tighter around her shoulders and walked to the mantel where their wedding photo sat beside Michael's final letter from Iraq. In that letter, written just weeks before the IED explosion that claimed his life, Michael had mentioned his partner Duke, a German shepherd who had saved countless lives detecting explosives. "He's got your eyes, Mom," Michael had written. "Same stubborn determination to protect everyone around him, even when it means putting himself in danger." She had never learned what happened to Duke after Michael's death. The Army had sent her Michael's personal effects, his medals, his final letters, but no word about the dog who had been her son's closest companion during those terrible months overseas. In her prayers each night, Grace asked God for a sign, some indication that her life still had purpose, that the loneliness and financial desperation weren't the end of her story. Outside, Millbrook's main street lay empty, except for Jake Whitmore's patrol truck making its early rounds. The town itself was dying slowly, its young people departing for cities with opportunities, leaving behind an aging population struggling to maintain community services and local businesses. The post office had reduced its hours. The elementary school had combined 3 grades into 1 classroom. Even Pastor Hayes at First Methodist had started talking about merging congregations with the Lutheran Church 2 towns over. But Grace had lived here her entire life. She had delivered half the town's babies during her decades as a nurse, had held the hands of their grandparents as they passed away. This wasn't just her house. It was her heart, her history, her connection to Harold and Michael. As she folded the foreclosure notice and placed it beside Michael's letter, Grace whispered the same prayer she had offered every night since losing her son. "Lord, if you're still listening to this old woman, please send me a sign that there's still some good I can do in this world." The violence started, as it always did, with the sound of Earl Thompson's truck slamming into the gravel driveway at 3 in the afternoon. 6-year-old Lily Mae, looked up from the book she was reading, Charlotte's Web, a gift from her mother before the accident, and felt her stomach clench with the familiar fear. Through the thin walls of the trailer, she could hear her grandfather's heavy boots stumbling up the wooden steps, followed by the crash of the screen door against the aluminum siding. "Lily May!" Earl's voice was thick with whiskey and rage. "Where'd you put my cigarettes, you little thief?" Lily pressed herself deeper into the corner of the cramped living room, clutching her mother's silver locket, the only thing of value she had left from her previous life. She hadn't touched his cigarettes. She never touched anything that belonged to Earl Thompson, having learned that lesson through bruises and harsh words over the past 6 months since the car accident that had taken both her parents and left her in his reluctant care. "I didn't take them, Grandpa Earl," she whispered, but her voice was too quiet to carry over his cursing as he tore through the kitchen cabinets, sending dishes crashing to the linoleum floor. Earl Thompson was 68 years old and had been drinking steadily since his son Tommy, Lily's father, had died in that twisted wreck of metal on Highway 2. The guilt ate at him worse than the whiskey, though he would never admit it to anyone, least of all to the wide-eyed child who looked so much like the son he had failed to save. Every time he looked at Lily May, he saw Tommy's gentle eyes and his late wife's stubborn chin, and the combination sent him reaching for another bottle to numb the self-loathing. "Don't lie to me!" Earl's fist slammed against the kitchen table, sending his empty beer bottles rolling to the floor where they shattered into brown glass fragments. "I know you've been going through my things just like your daddy used to, always taking what wasn't yours." That wasn't true, and Lily knew it. Her father had been the kindest man she'd ever known, patient and gentle, nothing like the bitter old man who now controlled her fate. Tommy had read to her every night, had taught her to sound out difficult words, had promised her that books would always be her friends, even when people let her down. Earl Thompson read nothing but the bottom of whiskey bottles and disability checks from the government. The slap came without warning, Earl's weathered hand connecting with Lily's cheek hard enough to knock her sideways. The silver locket went flying, skittering across the dirty carpet to land near the space heater that provided the trailer's only warmth. "That's for lying," Earl snarled, swaying slightly as he towered over her. "And this," another blow, this one to her shoulder, "is for being ungrateful. You got a roof over your head, don't you? Food in your belly? More than some kids get." Lily's cheek burned, but she had learned not to cry in front of him. Tears only made him angrier, reminded him of his own failures as a father and now as a guardian. She crawled toward her mother's locket, her small fingers closing around the warm silver as Earl continued his drunken tirade. "Your daddy was weak," he was saying, pacing back and forth in the narrow space between the couch and the television, "always reading books, always dreaming about something better. Look where it got him, dead in a ditch because he was too busy thinking instead of paying attention to the road." That was the lie, Earl told himself, but Lily remembered the police officer's words at the funeral. Black ice. Nothing anyone could have done. She remembered her father's careful driving, his hands always at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel, his constant reminders about seat belts and safety. The accident hadn't been Tommy's fault, but Earl needed someone to blame besides himself for the drinking problem that had driven his son away in the first place. As Earl's rage escalated and his threats grew more violent, Lily made a decision that would change everything. She waited until he turned his back to grab another bottle from the refrigerator, then she slipped out the trailer's back door and ran. She ran through the sparse pine trees behind their property, her breath coming in white puffs in the cold November air. She ran past the old mining equipment rusted along the creek bed, past the no trespassing signs that marked the edge of Pike National Forest. She ran until her legs ached and her lungs burned, driven by nothing but the desperate need to escape the trailer that smelled of stale beer and broken dreams. Night was falling fast in the Montana wilderness, and the temperature was dropping toward what the Weather Service would later call a record low for early November. But Lily Mae Thompson, clutching her mother's locket and wearing nothing but jeans, sneakers, and a thin pink sweater, kept running deeper into the forest, unaware that her flight from one kind of danger was leading her directly into another. The emergency room at Millbrook General buzzed with controlled chaos as Jake carried the unconscious child through the automatic doors, the dying German Shepherd cradled in Dr. Sarah Chen's arms behind him. Grace Sullivan had been sleeping fitfully when her phone rang at 4:47 a.m., Pastor Hayes's urgent voice cutting through her drowsy confusion. "Grace, you need to get to the hospital. They've found a child and a dog, and Jake thinks you need to see something." 20 minutes later, Grace stood in the sterile hallway outside the trauma bay, her gray hair still mussed from sleep, watching through the observation window as medical staff worked to stabilize the little girl they'd pulled from the forest. The child was so small, so fragile-looking under the harsh fluorescent lights, her blonde hair matted with snow and dirt, her pale skin slowly regaining color as the warming blankets did their work. But it was the dog that stopped Grace's heart. Doctor. Chen had discovered the hidden collar beneath the German Shepherd's thick winter coat, a tactical collar, military issue, with a small metal tag that caught the light as she held it up for Jake to examine. The tag was worn smooth by years of wear, but the engraving was still legible. PFC Michael Sullivan, K9 Unit, Duke. "That's impossible," Grace whispered, her hand reaching out to touch the cold metal. Her legs felt unsteady, the world tilting slightly as the implications crashed over her like a wave. "Duke died with Michael. The Army told me there were no survivors from that convoy." Jake's weathered face was grim as he studied the tag, his own memories of that terrible day in Iraq flooding back. He had been in the vehicle behind Michael's when the IED exploded, had pulled his friend's broken body from the wreckage while gunfire erupted around them. In the chaos and confusion, with wounded soldiers to evacuate and insurgents to fight off, no one had thought to look for Michael's dog. "The records show Duke was listed as MIA," Jake said quietly, his voice heavy with 5 years of guilt. "I always assumed he died in the blast or got picked up by locals. I never thought—" He trailed off, staring at the unconscious animal who was breathing with obvious difficulty on the examination table. Dr. Chen worked quickly, her practiced hands checking Duke's vital signs while explaining what she was finding. "He's severely dehydrated and hypothermic, but that's not what's killing him. This dog has been living rough for years. I can see old injuries that never healed properly, malnutrition and something else." She paused, her expression growing more concerned as she felt along Duke's abdomen. "There's a mass here. Without x-rays, I can't be certain, but I suspect we're looking at advanced cancer." Grace felt tears streaming down her cheeks as she reached through the cage bars to touch Duke's matted fur. At her touch, the dog's eyes opened. Brown eyes that looked exactly like Michael's, with the same gentle intelligence and stubborn determination her son had inherited from his father. "Hello, boy," she whispered, and Duke's tail gave the faintest wag of recognition. The trauma bay doors burst open, and Earl Thompson stumbled in, reeking of whiskey and shouting demands. "Where is she? Where's my granddaughter? You can't just take her without my permission." The contrast was stark and immediate, Earl's aggressive, drunken presence filling the sterile medical space with tension and fear, while the child on the gurney instinctively curled into a defensive position even in her unconscious state. Grace had seen enough domestic violence cases during her nursing career to recognize the signs, and her protective instincts flared to life. "Sir, you need to calm down," Jake said firmly, positioning himself between Earl and the child. "This is a medical facility, and your granddaughter needs treatment." "Don't tell me what my granddaughter needs," Earl snarled, swaying slightly as he pointed an accusatory finger at the assembled medical staff. "She ran off because she's ungrateful, that's all. Kids do that. I did it when I was her age. She'll get over it." Grace watched Earl Thompson with growing disgust and recognition. She had seen men like him before, broken by their own failures, drowning their guilt in alcohol, while the people who depended on them suffered the consequences. The child's malnourished appearance, her instinctive fear response, the way she had been found alone in the wilderness wearing inadequate clothing, it all painted a picture that made Grace's blood boil. "Now, this child was nearly dead from exposure," Dr. Chen said coldly, her professional demeanor barely concealing her anger. "She's suffering from hypothermia, dehydration, and shows signs of chronic malnutrition. We're required by law to report suspected child abuse." Earl's face flushed red with rage and shame. "You got no right. She's my blood, my responsibility. Her parents died and left her to me, and I've done the best I could. Maybe if that worthless son of mine had been a better driver, maybe if he hadn't been so damn selfish." "Stop!" Grace's voice cut through Earl's tirade like a blade, quiet but filled with decades of authority and moral certainty. "Just stop talking." She moved closer to the examination table where the little girl was beginning to stir, her small hand instinctively reaching out as if searching for something. Without thinking, Grace took the child's hand in her own, and the girl's eyes fluttered open, blue eyes the color of a Montana sky, filled with confusion and fear. "It's okay, sweetheart," Grace said softly. "You're safe now." The child's gaze moved past Grace to where Duke lay in the veterinary crate, and her face crumpled with worry. "Is he going to die?" she whispered, her first words since the rescue. Grace felt something shift inside her chest, a recognition that went deeper than logic or reason. This child, this dog, this moment, it felt like the answer to 5 years of prayers, the sign she had begged God to send her. "Not if we can help it," Grace promised, and knew with absolute certainty that she would fight anyone and anything to make sure both of them survived. The legal battle began 3 days after the rescue, when Maggie Foster from Montana Child Protective Services arrived at Grace's front door with a clipboard full of forms and a sympathetic but determined expression. Grace had spent those 3 days transforming her quiet house into a temporary haven for both Lily Mae and Duke, setting up the spare bedroom that had been Michael's with child-sized furniture borrowed from the church, and converting Harold's workshop into a recovery space for the injured dog. "Mrs. Sullivan," Maggie said, settling into the kitchen chair that Harold used to occupy, "I understand your desire to help this child, but we need to discuss the reality of the situation. You're 72 years old, living on a fixed income and facing foreclosure. These aren't ideal circumstances for taking on the responsibility of raising a traumatized 6-year-old. Grace watched through the kitchen window as Lily Mae sat cross-legged beside Duke's makeshift bed in the workshop, reading aloud from Charlotte's Web while the German Shepherd's breathing slowly steadied. The child had barely spoken to any of the adults since waking up in the hospital, but she chattered constantly to Duke, telling him stories, sharing her fears, promising him that everything would be okay if he just kept fighting. "That child has been through hell," Grace replied, turning back to face the social worker. "Her grandfather is an alcoholic who's been neglecting and abusing her for months. She ran away in the middle of winter rather than stay in that trailer for another night. And you're telling me that my age and financial situation are bigger concerns than leaving her with a man who nearly got her killed?" Maggie Foster had been working in Child Protective Services for 15 years, long enough to recognize both genuine care and impossible situations when she saw them. Grace Sullivan clearly loved the child and wanted what was best for her, but love alone didn't solve the practical problems of custody arrangements. Earl Thompson is her biological grandfather and legal guardian, Maggie explained patiently. He's agreed to enter an alcohol treatment program as part of our safety plan. The state would prefer to keep families together whenever possible, especially when the alternative placement involves significant risk factors. The conversation was interrupted by Dr. Chen's arrival, carrying a thick folder of veterinary records and wearing the grim expression that Grace recognized from her own nursing days, the look of someone who had to deliver difficult news. They moved to the living room, where late afternoon sunlight streamed through windows that Grace could no longer afford to properly maintain, highlighting the worn furniture and faded photographs that told the story of a life well lived, but now stretched to its financial limits. Duke's X-rays confirm what I suspected, Dr. Chen began, opening the folder to reveal images that even Grace's untrained eye could interpret as troubling. He has an aggressive abdominal tumor, probably liver cancer, that's been growing for months. In a younger dog, we might attempt surgery, but given his age, his other health issues, and the advanced stage of the disease, I'd estimate he has perhaps 6 to 8 weeks left. Grace felt the familiar ache of impending loss settle in her chest, the same hollow feeling she'd experienced when the doctors had explained Harold's cancer diagnosis, when the army chaplain had knocked on her door to tell her about Michael. But this time the grief was complicated by anger. Anger at the cruel irony of finding her son's beloved companion only to lose him again so quickly. "Does Lily May know?" Grace asked quietly. "I thought you should decide how to tell her," Dr. Chen replied. "But she'll figure it out soon enough. Children are remarkably perceptive about these things." That evening, after Maggie Foster had left with promises to return within the week for a formal home assessment, Grace sat with Lily May on the workshop floor beside Duke's bed. The dog was alert and responsive, his military training evident in the way he positioned himself protectively between the child and any potential threat, even in his weakened state. "Lily May," Grace said carefully, "we need to talk about Duke." The child's blue eyes filled with tears before Grace had even explained the diagnosis. "He's dying, isn't he?" Lily May whispered. "Like Mama and Daddy died. Like everyone I love dies." Grace gathered the small girl into her arms, feeling the sharp angles of shoulders that should have been rounder, the fragility of a child who had grown up too fast and lost too much. "Yes, sweetheart. Duke is very sick, and the doctor says he probably won't get better." "Because of me," Lily May sobbed against Grace's shoulder. "Because he had to save me in the snow. It's my fault he's dying. No, honey, listen to me." Grace held the child tighter, stroking her tangled blonde hair while choosing her words carefully. "Duke was already sick before he found you. Dr. Chen says he's been sick for a long time. But you know what? I think he was waiting for something important before he let go. I think he was waiting to find you and bring you somewhere safe." Over the following days, a routine developed that felt both natural and miraculous to Grace. She would wake at dawn to prepare breakfast, while Lily May checked on Duke, reporting on his appetite and energy level with the seriousness of a professional nurse. After breakfast, they would walk to the elementary school together, Duke managing the short distance with obvious effort, but refusing to be left behind. The sight of the elderly woman, the small child, and the dignified German shepherd walking down Millbrook's Main Street became a daily reminder to the community of the unusual family that had formed in their midst. The townspeople's reactions were mixed and often contentious. At the post office, Grace overheard Martha Hensley telling anyone who would listen that it was irresponsible for someone her age to take on such a burden. "That child needs younger parents, people who can keep up with her energy and provide for her future," Martha declared with the certainty of someone who had never raised children of her own. But others saw something different. Pastor Hayes visited twice a week, bringing casseroles and children's books, sharing stories of his own late-in-life adoption of his nephew after his brother's death. "Love doesn't have an expiration date," he told Grace during one of their conversations, "and that child has more stability and affection in your house than she's had in years." Jake Whitmore became a regular presence, stopping by each evening after his ranger duties to help with Duke's medication and to share stories of his service with Michael in Iraq. The conversations were healing for both of them. Jake finally able to process his survivor's guilt by honoring his fallen friend's memory. Grace learning details about her son's final months that the official Army reports had never included. "Michael talked about you constantly," Jake told her one evening as they watched Lily Mae practice reading to Duke in the workshop. "He was so proud of your nursing career, the way you dedicated your life to helping others. He used to say that Duke had the same protective instincts you did, always putting other people's needs first, even when it cost you something." The financial pressures continued to mount, despite the community's growing support. Grace's savings were rapidly depleted by Duke's veterinary bills and the costs of providing for Lily Mae, school supplies, clothing, the higher grocery bills that came with feeding a growing child. The foreclosure notice remained prominently displayed on her refrigerator, a daily reminder that love and good intentions weren't always enough to solve practical problems. Earl Thompson's court-mandated alcohol treatment program was progressing slowly, with mixed results. During his supervised visits with Lily Mae, he was sober but sullen, clearly resentful of the restrictions placed on his parental rights and defensive about his previous behavior. The child's reaction to these visits was telling. She would cling to Grace beforehand and remain unusually quiet for hours afterward, as if afraid that speaking too loudly might somehow result in being sent back to the trailer. "She's scared," Dr. Chen observed during one of Duke's weekly checkups. "Not just of Earl, but of getting attached to you and losing that too. This child has experienced so much loss that she's protecting herself by not hoping for too much." The observation proved accurate during a conversation Grace had with Lily Mae about their uncertain future. The child had been unusually quiet during dinner, picking at her food while Duke dozed beside her chair and finally looked up with eyes far too old for her 6 years. "Grandma Grace," Lily Mae said. She had started using the title naturally without prompting. "When Duke dies, will I have to go back to Grandpa Earl's trailer?" Grace felt her heart break a little more. "I don't know, sweetheart. I'm trying to convince the people who make those decisions that you should stay here with me. But it's complicated." "Because you're old," Lily Mae said matter-of-factly. "I heard Mrs. Hensley say you're too old to take care of a little girl." "What do you think?" Grace asked, curious about the child's perspective. Lily Mae considered this seriously, glancing over at Duke before answering. "I think maybe old people know more about loving because they've had more practice. And Duke is old too, but he saved my life. So maybe being old just means you're really good at the important stuff." The wisdom of children, Grace thought, often surpassed that of adults who had spent years learning to complicate simple truths. As Duke's condition gradually worsened, his bond with both Grace and Lily Mae deepened into something that transcended the normal relationship between humans and animals. He seemed to understand that his time was limited and that he had a mission to complete, not just protecting the child he had rescued, but somehow ensuring that the two people he had brought together would remain connected after he was gone. The community support network expanded as word of their story spread beyond Millbrook's borders. A reporter from the Billings Gazette wrote a feature article about the military dog who had saved a child's life, bringing donations from veteran organizations and animal welfare groups across Montana. But even as the financial pressure eased slightly, the legal challenges remained formidable, and Grace knew that the battle for Lily Mae's future was far from over. The custody hearing was scheduled for a gray Thursday morning in November, exactly 1 month after Duke had saved Lily Mae's life in the forest. Grace sat in the Flathead County Courthouse waiting room, her hands folded tightly in her lap, wearing the navy blue dress she had worn to Harold's funeral and Michael's memorial service, her armor for the most important battles of her life. Beside her, Jake Whitmore shifted uncomfortably in his dress uniform, the ribbons and medals on his chest catching the fluorescent light as he reviewed his testimony notes one final time. Lily Mae was not present for the hearing itself, having been placed in temporary foster care with Pastor Hayes and his wife during the legal proceedings. The separation had been devastating for both the child and Grace, but Maggie Foster had insisted it was necessary to prevent any appearance of impropriety while the court made its determination. Duke, meanwhile, was declining rapidly, his medication barely managing his pain as the cancer spread through his aging body. Earl Thompson entered the courtroom flanked by his court-appointed attorney, a tired-looking public defender named Robert Mills, who clearly wished he was handling any case other than this one. Earl had completed his mandatory 30-day alcohol treatment program, though his sobriety seemed fragile, and his resentment toward Grace was palpable. He had gained weight during his time in treatment, and his color was better, but there was something hollow about his appearance, as if the removal of alcohol had revealed an emptiness that had been festering beneath his addiction for years. Judge Patricia Hawkins, a stern woman in her 50s who had been handling family court cases for over 2 decades, called the proceedings to order with the weary efficiency of someone who had seen too many families torn apart by tragedy and poor choices. Grace's attorney, a young legal aid lawyer named David Chen, Dr. Sarah Chen's husband, who had volunteered to take the case pro bono, presented their opening statement with more passion than experience. "Your Honor," David began, "this case is about what serves the best interests of 6-year-old Lily Mae Thompson. The evidence will show that Grace Sullivan has provided this child with more stability, affection, and proper care in the past month than she received in the 6 months she lived with her grandfather. Mrs. Sullivan may be 72 years old, but she is a retired nurse with 40 years of experience caring for others. She has the full support of her community, and most importantly, she has formed a loving bond with Lily Mae that has helped the child begin to heal from severe trauma." Earl's attorney took a different approach, focusing on the legal precedent that favored biological relatives and raising concerns about Grace's age and financial situation. "Mr. Thompson acknowledges that he made mistakes during a period of grief following his son's death," Mills argued. "But he has completed court-mandated treatment. He is Lily Mae's closest living relative, and the state has a compelling interest in keeping families together whenever possible. Mrs. Sullivan, despite her good intentions, cannot provide the long-term stability this child needs." The testimony that followed was emotionally brutal for everyone involved. Dr. Chen presented her medical findings about Lily Mae's condition when she was rescued, the malnutrition, the signs of neglect, the psychological trauma that was evident in her behavior. Jake Whitmore described finding the child nearly dead from exposure, his military training evident in his precise, factual recounting of that night in the forest. But it was Grace's own testimony that provided the most compelling argument for her case. Judge Hawkins questioned her extensively about her age, her health, her financial resources, and her long-term plans for Lily Mae's care. "Mrs. Sullivan," the judge asked, "you're asking this court to award you custody of a young child when you're facing foreclosure on your home and living on a limited income. How do you propose to provide for this child's needs, including her education, health care, and future expenses?" Grace had prepared for this question, but answering it required her to reveal private information that she had hoped to keep confidential. "Your Honor, I recently discovered that my late husband had a life insurance policy that I was unaware of, as well as unclaimed veterans' benefits that are being processed. Additionally, the community has established a fund to help with Lily Mae's expenses." But more importantly, I believe I can offer this child something that money can't buy: unconditional love, stability, and the kind of patient, experienced care that comes from having spent a lifetime taking care of others. When Earl took the stand, his testimony was defensive and often contradictory. He insisted that he had never intentionally harmed Lily May, that his drinking had been a temporary response to grief, and that he was now capable of providing proper care. But under cross-examination, the extent of his neglect became clear. "Mr. Thompson," David Chen asked, "can you tell the court what grade Lily May is in?" Earl hesitated. "First grade, I think. Maybe second." "She's in kindergarten, Mr. Thompson. Can you tell the court the name of her teacher?" Another long pause. I don't recall exactly. Mrs. Patterson." "Can you tell the court what Lily May's favorite book is?" "I don't know why that matters," Earl snapped, his carefully maintained composure beginning to crack. "It matters because it shows whether you know this child at all. The answer is Charlotte's Web, the book her mother gave her before she died, a book that Lily May has been reading to Duke every day since Mrs. Sullivan took her in." The most damaging testimony came from Lily May's kindergarten teacher, who testified about the child's irregular attendance, her obvious hunger on the days she did come to school, and the concerning drawings she had made during art time, dark, violent images that suggested a child living in fear. As the hearing progressed, it became clear that this was about more than just the legal guardianship of one child. The entire community of Millbrook was being forced to confront uncomfortable truths about how they had allowed Earl Thompson's decline to go unchecked, how they had failed to protect a vulnerable child, and how sometimes doing the right thing required challenging established systems and assumptions. During a recess, Grace stepped outside the courthouse for air and found Jake smoking a cigarette with shaking hands, a habit he had picked up in Iraq and never fully abandoned during times of stress. "How do you think it's going?" she asked, though she was afraid to hear the answer. Jake took a long drag before responding. "Judge seems sympathetic to our side, but she's got to follow the law. Earl's completed his treatment program, he's sober, and he's blood family. That carries a lot of weight in these proceedings." Grace felt the familiar weight of helplessness that had plagued her since Harold's death, since Michael's deployment, since all the times in her life when love and good intentions hadn't been enough to prevent tragedy. "What happens if we lose?" "We don't give up," Jake said firmly. "There are appeals, other options, and Earl's sobriety is still fragile. If he relapses, we'll be right back here." The afternoon session focused on character witnesses and expert testimony. Pastor Hayes spoke about Grace's decades of community service and her natural rapport with children. Dr. Sarah Chen provided a professional assessment of Duke's role in Lily May's emotional recovery, explaining how the bond between the child and the dying dog had helped her begin to process her trauma. But the most powerful testimony came from an unexpected source. Maggie Foster, the social worker who had initially expressed concerns about Grace's age and financial situation, took the stand to provide what amounted to a complete reversal of her original position. "Your Honor," Maggie said, "I have been working in child protective services for 15 years, and I have seen hundreds of placement situations. In my professional opinion, Lily May Thompson has thrived in Mrs. Sullivan's care in ways that frankly surprised me. The child who was nearly catatonic when she was rescued is now speaking, laughing, engaging with other children at school, and showing remarkable resilience. Mrs. Sullivan may not be young, but she has created the kind of stable, nurturing environment that this traumatized child desperately needs." Earl's face grew red with anger as he listened to testimony that painted him as an unfit guardian, and his attorney had to place a restraining hand on his arm to prevent an outburst that would have destroyed any remaining chance of regaining custody. The hearing concluded with closing arguments that summarized the fundamental question before the court, whether biological ties and legal precedent should outweigh evidence of actual harm and demonstrated neglect. David Chen made an impassioned plea for Lily May's right to remain with the person who had shown her genuine love and care, while Earl's attorney focused on his client's completion of treatment and his legal status as the child's closest relative. Judge Hawkins announced that she would take the matter under advisement and render her decision within 1 week, a timeline that felt both impossibly long and terrifyingly short to everyone involved. That evening, Grace returned to her empty house, where Duke was waiting in his workshop bed, barely able to lift his head but still alert to her presence. She sat beside him on the concrete floor, stroking his gray muzzle while tears she had held back all day finally came. "I don't know if I did enough, boy," she whispered to the dying dog. "I don't know if love is going to be enough this time." Duke's brown eyes, so much like Michael's, seemed to hold an understanding that transcended words. His tail gave the faintest wag, and Grace chose to interpret it as reassurance, though she knew that both of them were running out of time to protect the child they had come to love. The call came at 2:47 a.m. on a Tuesday, jarring Grace from the fitful sleep that had become her norm since the custody hearing ended. Judge Hawkins had been deliberating for 5 days, 5 days during which Grace had barely eaten and Duke had continued his steady decline toward death. The voice on the other end belonged to Jake, and the words he spoke shattered what remained of Grace's fragile hope. "Grace, you need to get to the hospital. There's been an accident." The drive through Millbrook's empty streets felt surreal, the familiar landmarks blurred by tears and the kind of bone-deep fear that comes when everything you love hangs in the balance. At the hospital, Grace found Jake pacing in the emergency room waiting area, his ranger uniform wrinkled and his face drawn with exhaustion and grief. "Earl was driving drunk," Jake explained, his voice hollow. "Hit black ice on Highway 2, the same stretch where Lily May's parents died. His truck rolled 3 times before it hit the guardrail." Grace sank into one of the plastic chairs, feeling the cruel irony of the situation wash over her like a physical blow. The same stretch of highway, the same weather conditions, the same destructive choices that had orphaned Lily May in the first place. "Is he—" "He's alive, but barely. Massive head trauma, internal bleeding. Dr. Martinez doesn't think he'll make it through surgery." Jake sat down beside her, his hands clasped tightly together. "Grace, there's something else. They found empty whiskey bottles in the truck, and the accident happened right after he left the Roadhouse Tavern. He'd been drinking for hours." The news should have felt like vindication, proof that Earl Thompson was exactly the unfit guardian Grace had argued he was in court. Instead, she felt only sadness for a broken man who had never learned to process his grief without destroying himself and everyone around him. Tommy Thompson's death in that car accident 6 months ago had triggered a cascade of tragedy that now threatened to claim his father as well. Dr. Elena Martinez emerged from the surgical suite 3 hours later, her scrubs stained with blood and her expression grim. Grace and Jake rose to meet her, dreading the words they knew were coming. "We did everything we could," Dr. Martinez said quietly. "Mr. Thompson's injuries were too extensive. The head trauma caused massive brain swelling, and the internal bleeding couldn't be controlled. He passed away about 20 minutes ago." Grace felt a complex mixture of emotions. Relief that Lily May would never have to return to that trailer, guilt over feeling relieved about a man's death, and overwhelming sadness for the waste of a life that might have been salvaged if Earl had found the strength to confront his demons instead of drowning them. "What happens now?" Grace asked. "With Lily May, I mean. Legally, Earl's death changes everything. Jake replied. He was her only living relative. Unless there's someone else who comes forward to claim custody, you're the most logical guardian. But Grace's relief was short-lived. Within hours of Earl's death, Margaret Foster from Child Protective Services arrived with news that transformed hope into despair. There had been a development in Lily May's case that no one had anticipated. "We've located Earl's sister in California," Maggie explained as they sat in the hospital cafeteria, surrounded by the clinical smell of disinfectant and reheated food. "Linda Morrison, Earl's younger sister. She lives in Sacramento with her husband and 2 teenage children. She's flying out tomorrow to claim custody of Lily May." Grace felt the world tilt beneath her feet. "I've never heard Earl mention a sister. Lily May has never mentioned an aunt. According to Linda, there was a family rift years ago. She and Earl hadn't spoken since before Lily May was born, but she is the child's biological aunt, and she's financially stable with no history of substance abuse or neglect. The state will almost certainly award her custody." The news was devastating, but what followed was worse. Linda Morrison arrived in Millbrook 2 days later, a perfectly groomed woman in her mid-50s with highlighted hair, expensive clothes, and the kind of confident demeanor that came from never having to worry about foreclosure notices or prescription costs. She took one look at Grace's modest home, at Duke's deteriorating condition, and at the small-town poverty that surrounded them, and made her position clear. "I appreciate what you've done for Lily May during this difficult time," Linda said with the condescending politeness of someone accustomed to getting her way. "But she needs to be with family now, real family, people who can provide for her future and give her opportunities she'll never have in a place like this." Grace watched helplessly as Linda dismissed everything that had been built over the past 6 weeks. The tentative trust, the bedtime routines, the careful healing that had begun to mend Lily May's traumatic wounds. To Linda Morrison, these were merely temporary arrangements that had served their purpose and could now be discarded. The confrontation came to a head when Linda announced her intention to take Lily May back to California immediately before Duke died. "It's not healthy for a child to watch an animal suffer," she declared with clinical detachment. "Better to make a clean break now, before she gets more attached." "She's already attached," Grace replied, fighting to keep her voice steady. "Duke saved her life. Leaving him now, when he's dying, would be another abandonment for a child who's already lost everyone she's ever loved." "She has family now," Linda snapped. "Real family, who can give her a real future, not some old woman playing house with a dying dog in a town that's falling apart." The argument escalated until Pastor Hayes intervened, suggesting that they allow Judge Hawkins to make the final determination about what was in Lily May's best interests. But everyone knew that Linda Morrison's claim was legally ironclad. She was blood family, financially stable, and offering opportunities that Grace's limited resources could never match. That night, Grace sat beside Duke's bed in the workshop, holding Lily May as the child sobbed against her shoulder. The little girl had overheard enough of the adults' conversations to understand that she was going to be taken away again, sent to live with strangers in a place where she knew no one. "I don't want to go to California," Lily May whispered through her tears. "I want to stay here with you and Duke. This is my home now." Grace stroked the child's hair, breathing in the scent of the strawberry shampoo they had chosen together during their first shopping trip, memorizing the weight of the small body in her arms. "I know, sweetheart. I want you to stay, too. But sometimes grown-ups make decisions that don't feel fair to children." Duke raised his head with obvious effort, his brown eyes focusing on the crying child with the same protective intensity he had shown that night in the forest. With tremendous difficulty, he struggled to his feet and moved closer, pressing his warm body against Lily May in a gesture of comfort that transcended words. "He's trying to tell me something," Lily May said, her tears slowing as she buried her face in Duke's thick fur. "He's trying to tell me to be brave." Grace felt her own tears falling as she watched the dying dog use his last reserves of strength to comfort the child he had saved. Tomorrow, Linda Morrison would arrive with legal papers and plans to take Lily May away. In a few days, Duke would be gone forever, and Grace would be alone again in her empty house, with nothing but memories and the knowledge that love, despite all her hopes and prayers, had not been enough to keep her improvised family together. The revelation came from the most unexpected source imaginable. Linda Morrison had been in Millbrook for less than 24 hours when she made a discovery that would change everything. While sorting through Earl's personal effects at the trailer, a task she approached with the efficient detachment of someone liquidating an estate, she found a shoebox hidden beneath his bed, filled with documents that told a story no one had suspected. Grace was sitting in her kitchen with Lily May, helping the child pack her few belongings for the move to California, when Jake arrived with Linda Morrison in tow. The woman's perfectly composed demeanor had cracked, replaced by something that looked like shock and genuine distress. "We need to talk," Linda said, her voice shaking as she set the shoebox on Grace's kitchen table. "All of us. There are things about Earl, about our family, that I never knew." The documents inside the box painted a picture of Earl Thompson that was far more complex and tragic than anyone had realized. There were medical records showing a diagnosis of early-onset dementia that Earl had hidden from everyone, including the court. There were letters from Tommy, Lily May's father, pleading with his father to get help for his drinking and describing incidents of violence that had driven him to move across the state to protect his own family. And most damning of all, there was a confession letter that Earl had apparently written but never sent, detailing his role in the accident that had killed Tommy and his wife. "He was supposed to pick them up that night," Linda read from the letter, her voice barely above a whisper. "Tommy called him because their car wouldn't start, asked him to come get them and Lily May from the restaurant where they'd been celebrating their anniversary. But Earl was drunk, so drunk he could barely stand, and he told Tommy he couldn't drive. So Tommy tried to get the car started, and when it finally turned over, he was driving too fast trying to get home before the storm got worse." Grace felt the pieces of a puzzle falling into place with sickening clarity. Earl's guilt wasn't just about being a bad grandfather to Lily May. It was about being the reason she was orphaned in the first place. His drinking, his violence, his inability to function as a parent had created the chain of events that led to his son's death. "There's more," Linda continued, pulling out a stack of photographs. Pictures of Tommy as a child, covered in bruises. Medical records from when he was hospitalized at age 12 with a broken arm and fractured ribs. Earl was abusing his own son for years, and Tommy spent his adult life trying to protect Lily May from the same fate. Jake examined the documents with the methodical attention he had learned in the military, cross-referencing dates and details with a growing sense of horror. This explains why Tommy moved so far away, why he never brought Lily May to visit her grandfather until after the accident. He was protecting her. Lily May, who had been listening with the unnaturally mature attention that traumatized children develop, looked up from the drawings she had been making. "Daddy said Grandpa Earl was sick," she said quietly. "He said some people get sick in their hearts, and it makes them hurt other people even when they don't want to." Linda Morrison's carefully constructed worldview was crumbling as she absorbed the implications of what she had discovered. She had flown to Montana expecting to rescue her niece from poverty and small-town limitations, only to learn that her brother's legacy was far darker than she had ever imagined. "I didn't know," she said, tears streaming down her perfectly made-up face. "Earl and I lost touch when I went to college, and then when I got married, he said I thought I was too good for the family. I tried to reconnect a few times over the years, but he was always drunk when I called, always angry about something. I thought he was just a bitter old man who couldn't handle retirement." Grace reached across the table to take Linda's hand, recognizing the particular grief that comes from discovering that someone you thought you knew had been capable of terrible things. "You couldn't have known. Earl was very good at hiding his problems from people outside the family." But Linda's distress went deeper than simple shock at her brother's behavior. As she continued reading through the documents, she found evidence that challenged her own assumptions about what was best for Lily May. "There's a letter here from Tommy to Earl, written just a few weeks before the accident," Linda said, unfolding a piece of paper that had been creased and refolded many times. Tommy was writing about his fears for Lily May's future, about what would happen to her if something happened to him and his wife. He specifically mentions that he didn't want her to end up in the foster care system, that he wanted her to be raised by someone who understood the importance of stability and unconditional love. Grace felt her heart stop as Linda continued reading Tommy's words aloud. "Dad, I know we've had our problems, and I know you're not capable of taking care of Lily May if something happens to us. But if the worst should occur, I hope you'll find someone who can love her the way she deserves to be loved. Someone patient and kind, someone who won't give up on her when things get difficult. I don't care about money or status or any of that. I just want my daughter to know what it feels like to be truly wanted." The kitchen fell silent as the implications of Tommy's words sank in. He had known, somehow, that his father was not capable of caring for his daughter. His letter was almost prophetic in its understanding of what Lily May would need if she lost her parents. Linda looked across the table at Grace, seeing her perhaps for the first time not as an inadequate substitute, but as exactly the kind of person her brother had hoped would enter his daughter's life. The evidence was all around them. Lily May's obvious attachment to Grace, her dramatic improvement in the weeks since the rescue, her natural ease in this modest house that had become a home. "I came here thinking I was saving her," Linda said slowly. "But maybe I was wrong about what she needs saving from." Jake, who had been quiet during most of this revelation, finally spoke up. "Mrs. Morrison, with respect, what can you offer Lily May that she doesn't already have here?" Linda considered the question seriously, looking around Grace's kitchen with its mismatched chairs and well-worn linoleum, at the child's drawings stuck to the refrigerator with magnets, at the dog bed in the corner where Duke dozed fitfully. Her own home in Sacramento was beautiful and spacious, filled with expensive furniture and the latest technology. Her children attended private schools and took piano lessons and went to summer camps that cost more than Grace's monthly pension. "I can give her opportunities," Linda said finally. "Better schools, cultural advantages, financial security." "And what will she give up?" Jake pressed. "Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like she's already found something pretty valuable here." As if summoned by their conversation, Duke stirred in his bed and struggled to his feet, moving slowly toward Lily May with the determination that had characterized his entire military career. The child instinctively reached out to steady him, her small hands gentle but confident as she helped him settle beside her chair. "Duke's teaching me to be brave," Lily May said to her aunt, her voice clear and strong despite the tears that had been falling earlier. "And Grandma Grace is teaching me to cook and to take care of people when they're sick. And Mr. Jake is teaching me about Daddy's Army friends and how they all looked out for each other." Linda watched this interaction with growing understanding. Her niece wasn't just surviving in this environment, she was thriving, developing the kind of resilience and empathy that no amount of money could purchase. The turning point came when Lily May herself addressed the question that all the adults had been dancing around. "Aunt Linda," she said with the directness that children possess, "do you really want me to come live with you, or do you just think you're supposed to want that?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, forcing Linda to confront the difference between obligation and genuine desire. She had convinced herself that taking custody of Lily May was the right thing to do, but she had never honestly examined whether it was what either of them actually wanted. "I thought it was what your daddy would have wanted," Linda replied carefully. "I thought family should be with family." Lily May looked around the kitchen, at Grace, who had spent sleepless nights caring for both her and Duke, at Jake, who had become the father figure she had lost, at Duke, who had literally saved her life and continued to comfort her through nightmares and fears. "I think this is my family now," Lily May said simply. "I think maybe family isn't just about who you're born to. Maybe it's about who chooses to love you and take care of you even when it's hard." Linda Morrison felt something shift inside her chest, a recognition that her niece possessed a wisdom that had taken Linda decades to acquire. The child had found her place in the world, had formed bonds that went deeper than blood relationships or financial advantages. "You're right," Linda said quietly, wiping away tears that had nothing to do with grief and everything to do with relief. "You're absolutely right." That evening, Linda Morrison made a phone call to her lawyer in Sacramento, instructing him to withdraw her custody petition. Instead, she would provide financial support for Lily May's care while allowing her to remain with Grace, visiting regularly but not disrupting the stability that had been so carefully built. As the adults finalized these arrangements, Lily May curled up beside Duke's bed, reading to him from Charlotte's Web, the story of unlikely friendship and sacrifice that had become their shared favorite. Duke's breathing was labored now, his time clearly measured in days rather than weeks, but his eyes remained alert and focused on the child he had saved. "Do you think Charlotte knew she was going to die when she decided to help Wilbur?" Lily May asked Grace as they prepared for bed that night. Grace considered the question carefully, understanding that they were talking about more than just a children's story. "I think she knew that some things are more important than living a long time, like making sure the people you love are safe and happy." Lily May nodded solemnly, processing this wisdom with the gravity of someone who had experienced more loss than most adults. "Duke's like Charlotte, isn't he?" "He's making sure I'm safe before he has to go." Grace tucked the blankets around Lily May's small form, marveling at the child's resilience and insight. "Yes, sweetheart. I think Duke is exactly like Charlotte. And just like in the story, the love he's given you will stay with you forever, even after he's gone." Duke died on a Sunday morning in December, 3 weeks after Linda Morrison had returned to California, and 6 weeks after he had saved Lily May's life in the forest. Grace woke at dawn with the instinctive knowledge that comes to those who have spent decades caring for the dying, the understanding that this would be Duke's last day. She found him in his workshop bed, breathing slowly and peacefully, his brown eyes still alert but holding a distant quality that suggested he was already beginning his journey toward whatever waited beyond. Lily May sensed it too. She came downstairs earlier than usual, still in her pajamas, and went directly to Duke's side without a word. She curled up next to him on the old blanket that had become his final resting place, her small hand resting on his graying muzzle while she hummed a lullaby her mother had sung to her years ago. "Is today the day?" she asked Grace quietly, and there was no fear in her voice, only the kind of acceptance that comes from having already lost so much that death no longer held the terror it might for other children. "I think it might be, sweetheart," Grace replied, settling onto the concrete floor beside them both. At 72, her joints protested against the hard surface, but nothing could have moved her from Duke's side during these final hours. Jake arrived shortly after 8 o'clock, bringing coffee for Grace and hot chocolate for Lily May, understanding without being told that this vigil required his presence. He had lost enough friends in Iraq to recognize the signs, and he knew that Duke, like the soldier he had always been, would wait until his family was assembled before letting go. Dr. Sarah Chen came by around 10, not to provide medical intervention but to offer comfort and to confirm what they all already knew. Duke's breathing was becoming more labored and his heart rate was slowing steadily. There was no pain, she assured them. The medication was managing his discomfort, and his body was simply shutting down naturally as the cancer claimed its final victory. "He's been fighting this disease for months," Dr. Chen explained gently. "Probably since before he found Lily May in the forest. But he's held on long enough to make sure she was safe, to bring you two together. Now he can rest." Pastor Hayes arrived with several members of the congregation, creating an impromptu memorial service that honored Duke's life and service. They told stories of his military career, of his dramatic rescue of Lily May, of the way he had brought healing and purpose to Grace's lonely life. But the most meaningful tributes came from Lily May herself, who spoke to Duke in the quiet, conversational tone she had used during all their weeks together. "Thank you for finding me in the snow," she whispered, her face pressed against his neck. "Thank you for bringing me to Grandma Grace. Thank you for teaching me to be brave like you." As the day progressed, more people arrived to pay their respects. Martha Hensley, who had been among Duke's harshest critics, brought a handmade wreath and an apology for her earlier judgment. The elementary school principal came with drawings that Lily May's classmates had made, pictures of dogs with wings and children holding hands in fields of flowers. Even Earl Thompson's former drinking buddies stopped by, sober and solemn, to acknowledge the heroism of the dog who had saved the child their friend had failed to protect. The moment came just as the sun was setting over the Montana mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink that reminded Grace of the colors in Michael's childhood bedroom. Duke's breathing had become increasingly shallow throughout the afternoon, and now it slowed to long, peaceful intervals that grew further and further apart. Lily May was reading aloud from Charlotte's Web, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her cheeks. She had reached the part where Charlotte explains to Wilbur that death is simply a part of life, that what matters is not how long we live, but how much love we give and receive while we're here. "I have had a happy life," Lily May read, her voice breaking slightly on the words. "I have been able to help Wilbur, and that makes my life worthwhile." Duke's eyes found Grace's face, and in that moment she saw not just the dying military dog, but a reflection of her son Michael. The same gentle intelligence, the same selfless courage, the same capacity for love that transcended duty and expectation. She placed her hand on his head, feeling the warmth of his fur beneath her palm, and whispered the words she had never been able to say to Michael before he left for his final mission. "Go in peace, my brave boy. Your job here is finished. You brought her home to me, and I promise I'll take care of her forever." Duke's tail moved slightly, one final wag of acknowledgement, and then his breathing stopped. The silence that followed was profound but not empty. It was filled with gratitude and love and the kind of peaceful acceptance that comes when a life has been lived with purpose and completed with dignity. Lily May continued to lie beside Duke for several minutes after he died, her small hand resting on his still chest. When she finally looked up, her eyes were red with tears but also bright with something that looked like understanding. "He waited for us to say goodbye," she said to Grace. "He could have died any time, but he waited until we were all here together." Grace nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. In her 40 years as a nurse, she had witnessed countless deaths, but none had affected her as deeply as this quiet passing of a dog who had given everything he had to protect a child he barely knew. The funeral 3 days later was unlike anything Millbrook had ever seen. The entire town turned out to honor Duke, along with veterans from across Montana who had heard his story and wanted to pay their respects to a fallen comrade. Jake had arranged for a military honor guard, and Duke was buried with full honors in the small cemetery behind First Methodist Church, his grave marked with a headstone that read, "Duke, Military Working Dog, Hero, Guardian, Family." Linda Morrison flew in from California for the service, bringing her own children to meet their cousin and to witness the kind of community support that money couldn't buy. She watched as Lily May stood beside Duke's grave, her small hand in Grace's weathered one, and knew with absolute certainty that she had made the right decision in allowing her niece to remain in Millbrook. In the weeks that followed Duke's death, Grace and Lily May began the slow process of rebuilding their lives around the absence of their beloved companion. The workshop was cleaned and converted into a reading room, filled with books and comfortable chairs where they could remember Duke while creating new memories together. The community rallied around them with continued support, ensuring that Grace's financial concerns were addressed and that Lily May had everything she needed to thrive. Judge Hawkins officially awarded custody to Grace in a brief hearing that felt more like a formality than a legal proceeding. Linda Morrison's withdrawal from the custody battle, combined with Earl Thompson's death and the revelation of his history of abuse, had made Grace's guardianship a foregone conclusion. "Mrs. Sullivan," Judge Hawkins said as she signed the final papers, "this court finds that you have provided this child with exactly what she needs, not just material care, but the kind of unconditional love and stability that will allow her to heal from her trauma and build a positive future. Lily May is fortunate to have found her way to you." On Christmas morning, Grace and Lily May visited Duke's grave together, bringing fresh flowers and a new tennis ball that they placed beside his headstone. The snow was falling gently, reminiscent of that night when everything had changed, but now the cold held no terror, only the promise of renewal and new beginnings. "Do you think Duke can see us?" Lily May asked, as they stood in the quiet cemetery, their breath forming white clouds in the crisp air. Grace considered the question seriously, looking out over the mountains where Jake was probably making his morning patrol, where other families were gathering for their own Christmas celebrations, where life continued in all its complex beauty and sorrow. "I think love doesn't end when someone dies," she replied. "I think Duke's love for you, and your daddy's love, and even my Michael's love, I think it all continues, even when we can't see it anymore. And I think that love brought us together, and it's going to keep us together no matter what happens next." Lily May nodded solemnly, then surprised Grace by smiling, the kind of genuine, unguarded smile that had been rare during her early weeks in Grace's care, but was becoming more frequent as she learned to trust in the permanence of their bond. "Merry Christmas, Duke," she called to the grave, her voice carrying across the snow-covered cemetery. "Thank you for giving me the best present ever, a real family." As they walked home together, Grace felt a profound sense of completion. Her prayers for a sign, for purpose, for connection had been answered in the most unexpected way possible. She had found her calling not in the hospital where she had spent her career, but in the simple act of loving a child who needed her and honoring the memory of a dog who had brought them together. The house that had once echoed with loneliness now rang with laughter and conversation. And Grace Sullivan, at 72 years old, discovered that the best chapters of her life were still being written. Dear friends, Grace Sullivan's story reminds us that our most meaningful chapters often begin when we think our story is ending. At 72, facing foreclosure and profound loneliness after losing her husband and son, Grace believed her purpose had passed. Yet God had different plans, sending her a dying military dog and a traumatized child who needed exactly what she had to offer: a lifetime of nurturing experience, unconditional love, and the wisdom that comes from surviving life's deepest sorrows. Grace discovered that age isn't a limitation, it's preparation. Her years of caring for others as a nurse, her understanding of grief, her patient heart shaped by decades of service, all equipped her perfectly for this unexpected calling. Duke's sacrifice brought together two souls who desperately needed each other, proving that family isn't always blood. Sometimes it's who shows up when the world feels darkest. Grace's empty house became a home again, filled with bedtime stories, shared meals, and the irreplaceable joy of being needed. Her golden years weren't spent in quiet retirement, but in the vibrant, challenging, beautiful work of raising a child who saw her not as too old, but as exactly what she needed. Sometimes our greatest adventures are just beginning. What unexpected blessing has arrived in your life when you least expected it? How has your life experience prepared you to serve others in ways you never imagined? Share your story below. We'd love to hear how your wisdom has made a difference.